All right, well, welcome. We will get started in just a couple of minutes. Welcome, we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to today's virtual tour with the Timken. A couple of housekeeping things before we get started. If you're with us here over Zoom, please keep yourselves muted while Eleanor is presenting today. You're already muted, so there's no problem there. If you do have any questions while the presentation is ongoing, please save your questions until the end. At the end, we'll be happy to open that up. You can either at that point unmute yourself, or if you would like to use the chat function, you can do so at any time. There should be a little chat button at the bottom of your screen, and you can go ahead and use that in order to type your questions, and we'd be happy to address those at the end. If you are joining us over Facebook, welcome to you as well. If you would like to ask any questions, you can use the comment section on the Facebook post, and that way you can ask your questions there, and we'll be monitoring that as well and addressing those at the end as well. Otherwise, though, without further ado, I would like to present today's docent. Her name's Eleanor. She'll be presenting on Rembrandt and his colleagues, and we're very excited to have her. So I'll go ahead and turn that over to her.
Thanks, Samantha. Well, greetings to everyone and welcome to the Timken Museum and our virtual tour. I'll be talking today about Rembrandt and his colleagues, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce some of our greatest works in the Timken Museum to you. Now, a bit of background will help in understanding the works that we'll be taking a look at. They consist of artists who were Dutch and Flemish. And I'll start with a map of the Netherlands, which shows that in the 17th century, the Netherlands consisted of the Northern Netherlands and the Southern Netherlands. Now, the Southern Netherlands was a Catholic country under the rule of the Spanish Habsburgs, and its people were referred to as Flemish, the largest county, Flanders being the largest county, and its richest and most important county. Artists from the Spanish Netherlands generally painted in the Baroque style, which was prevalent throughout the rest of Europe. And this is characterized by drama, rich, deep color, intense light, and dark shadows. Now, there's quite a different story in the North. The 17th century in the North was a unique era of political, economic, and cultural greatness, during which the newly minted country of Holland ranked among the most powerful and influential in both Europe and the world. And it was erupting with artists of such skill and inventiveness that they continue to enthrall us to today. So what accounted for this burst of genius? Well, three things, and three words describe them: independence, prosperity, and Protestantism. These can explain 17th century Holland. After a long, victorious war of independence from Spain, a new ruling class emerges that quickly garners immense riches from its maritime empire. And how did the Dutch spend their newfound wealth? Well, recall that Calvinism, the form of Protestantism that prevailed in the North, forbade pretension, ostentation, or self-aggrandizement, any sin of pride. These were all sins of pride. So strict Calvinists couldn't display or consume evidence of their success. You know, they couldn't flout their landed estates or their fashionable clothing. The only material objects that flew under the radar were paintings. So they commissioned paintings, and for this few short decades, an entire body of truly brilliant artists arose, wonderfully capable of meeting the challenge. They painted in a new style of realism, which referred back to the early Netherlandish artists like Jan van Eyck. And what did they paint? Well, Calvinism forbade what had been the primary source of funding and imagery, the church and ecclesiastical image. So rather, painters turned to art that reflects themselves, that tells them who they are and what they aspire to. Toward this end, artists devised 4 categories of painting, which they either invent, innovate, or elevate. 3 are unique to the Dutch. First, genre art, paintings that celebrate their daily lives. Such art was totally unknown in other countries, and an explanation perhaps residing in the Dutch love of their home and the family it shelters. Second, they innovate and breathe new life into still lives. The Dutch virtually invented still lives, evidenced by the fact that the English term derives from the Dutch word stil even, things that stand still. Up until then, still lives were mere wall decorations or space keepers. Third, they celebrate landscape, raising it to the status of primary subject matter. Before it was secondary, a stage setting the actions, but not for the Dutch, who love their flat, uninspired, and uninspiring landscape. They fought hard for every meter of that land against the Spanish and the sea, and it was a great source of pride. And the last or 4th category is portraits, which of course the Dutch didn't invent, but all you need to do is mention Rembrandt, with whom we could open and close our discussions. But there's much more to Dutch portraiture than Rembrandt. There's Frans Hals. I'm excited to share with you examples of each of these new styles in our tour today. But let's step back to begin with the earliest work in the gallery, Death of the Virgin, which dates from 1460 to 65, and it's by the artist Petrus Christus. Now, this is one of less than 40 known works that Petrus Christus did, and he excelled in portraits and religious work. He was a 2nd-generation Flemish artist who lived in Bruges, which was the center of commerce from 1444 until his death in 1475. While he was too late to study with the court painter Jan van Eyck, Christus was greatly influenced by that master's work and may have taken over his workshop. Specifically, Petrus Christus combined the jewel-like colors and interplay of light achieved through the Flemish breakthroughs in the use of oil paints and glazing techniques associated with Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden. And he was the first Flemish artist to utilize the Florentine one-point perspective system of the architects Brunelleschi and Alberti. And here you see the perspective lines drawing to a single point on a black and white copy of the work as it was originally created, with 2 wings forming a triptych, which were destroyed by fire in World War II. And let me show you what those wings were. And here are images of the 2 wings, St. John the Baptist on the left and St. Catherine on the right. Now, the large size of the saints stresses the fact that they're outside the specific context of the scene in the center and suggest that they're serving the divine representations of the donors, whomever they may have been. So back to our panel. Interestingly, this was the largest work done by Petrus Christus, and it suggests that it was intended as an altarpiece, likely created for a wealthy patron for use as a devotional object in a private chapel. The story of Death of the Virgin is recounted in the Golden Legend, where there are details of the gathering of the apostles from all over the world. What makes the painting so unusual is that it shows 3 episodes of the story in one painting, all tied together by the color red. The scene takes place in a Dutch bedroom, and we know that because the bed curtains are folded into themselves. The first story tells the death or the dormition, which means falling asleep, of Mary. She's laying on the bed, holding a candle, a symbol of her faith. The apostles have gathered to give her the last rites. And they all, if you take a look at their faces, they all look tired with flat faces, dark circles under or around red eyes, and at least one appears to be asleep. Most are barefoot, perhaps because being barefoot can mean you're in the presence of someone holy, or in recognition of mourning. Notice also their ovoid faces and that their feet appear to be boneless, have no bones. So that's the first story. Now, second story, above the angels bear Mary's soul to heaven, where God the Father welcomes her with open arms. And finally, looking out the window, you see doubting Thomas, and an angel is dropping the Virgin's girdle or belt or sash to St. Thomas as proof of her assumption, body and soul, into heaven. So ends the story of Death of the Virgin. Now, moving to the 16th century, we have a work by Pieter Bruegel the Elder, considered one of the greatest Flemish Netherlandish painters. More than any other painter, he helped free landscapes from their dependence on religion. So in this painting, it's called Parable of the Sower. It dates from 1557. And in this painting, Bruegel depicts the Bible's parable as of the sower. Now, partly as a reflection of the newly grasped sense of the vastness and the variety of earth. Remember that at this time, the Dutch were very important in world trade, and painters began increasing the space and depth of their landscape backgrounds. In the distance of the painting, we can see ships are well on their way out to sea, indicating trade and a busy port. Bruegel had recently returned to Antwerp in 1555, following a 2-year stay in Rome. And this landscape from 1557 is actually an evocation of scenery he'd seen on his trip. Because if you know the Netherlands, you know the Netherlands are extremely flat, and yet we have a mountainous view here. So he's evoking his trip through Italy and the Alps. The biblical story is played out in the foreground at the left, where a humble peasant scatters seeds on rocky soil. The house behind him is lit by morning sun. Now, according to St. Matthew, some seeds fell by the wayside and the small birds devoured them up. Some fell in stony places where they didn't have much earth, and some fell among thorns, but others fell into good, fertile ground and brought forth root. So that's the parable of the sower. Now, the picture you'll notice is cut diagonally with a wide river, indicating there are two parts to the story. So mirroring the first part of the story is Jesus, who's giving a sermon to his parishioners on the far side of the shore. And these people gather to listen to Jesus deliver his message of salvation. And like the seeds falling on the soil, Jesus' words represent the seeds, and the parishioners represent the soil. Like the seeds falling on the soil, some will not listen to him, but others will heed his words, and faith will blossom in them. Moving forward in time, one of the most important landscape artists of this Dutch period was Jacob van Ruysdael. There was arguably no 17th century Dutch artist who captured the flatness and expanse of the Dutch landscape better than van Ruysdael. This work, a view of Haarlem and bleaching fields, was done between 1665 and 1670. Now, Jacob van Ruysdael learned to paint from his father, who was a frame maker and art dealer, and from his uncle, Solomon van Ruysdael. After studying landscape painting in Germany for 10 years, he settled in Amsterdam, and there he maintained a flourishing painting studio where he trained the next generation of Dutch landscape painters. The subject of this painting is the bleaching of clothing and uncut cloth. Next to brewing, bleaching was the most important industry in Haarlem, and the renown of Haarlem bleaching was such that visitors from foreign locales, as well as from the city proper, visited the countryside to see the process in action. Outsiders might have purchased images like this one as souvenirs, but more likely, the owners of these paintings were Dutch, for whom the landscape was a point of pride. The various steps in the bleaching of linen occurred over a period of 7 months. The sand dunes surrounding Haarlem provided the best linen bleaching conditions in Europe, and the lucrative dairy industry provided the byproduct of buttermilk, which would have been discarded had it not been used for bleaching. So Haarlem had all of the necessities for bleaching and became quite well known in this industry. Depicted from a raised vantage point, the landscape occupying the lower third of the canvas is flat and expansive. The artist arranges the buildings and the rows of linen to lead the eye diagonally through alternating areas of shadow and light. In contrast to the enormous, puffy, cumulus clouds above, the land is marked by carefully plotted fields, tidy houses, and detailed greenery. Sky and earth are separated by a nearly straight horizon, which was typical of 17th century landscapes. The presence of the church St. Bavo's on the horizon identifies the city beyond as Haarlem, at the same time suggesting the role of divine providence in the success of the Dutch. Van Ruysdael completed about 15 views of Haarlem showing the linen bleaching fields, and in addition to making 700 paintings and 100 drawings, Ruysdael received a medical degree in 1676 and probably pursued a successful second career as a surgeon. He died in 1682 and is buried in St. Bavo's. Let's now move on to another of the genre associated with the Dutch, the still life genre. And this still life is done by the master Pieter Cleyes. Now, Cleyes was the foremost still life painter in Haarlem, and Haarlem was, as we mentioned, was the leading center of artistic life in 17th century Holland. The work was done in 1627. early in his career. Claes specialized in a type of still life that his countrymen called breakfast pieces, which are comprised of ingredients from an ordinary informal meal. So you've got smoking supplies, the taper and the pipe, a goblet of dark beer, a brazier glowing with the hot charcoals, and they're all arranged around a pewter plate with smoked herring in the foreground. Remarkable and new in this type of still life is the implied presence of an individual who may have been interrupted in his meal, and we don't know whether he's going to return or not, but clearly the meal is in progress. Now, Claes also knew about the material possessions of a wealthy household, and he painted those on occasion. Known as vanitas paintings, these works are ripe with symbolic objects intended to emphasize the transience of life, the futility of earthly pleasure, and the inevitability of death. The ever-present morality and humility central to the Calvinist faith tempered Dutch pride in worldly goods. Now, vanitas paintings are closely related to an earlier tradition known as memento mori, which is Latin for remember you must die. And these are artworks intended to prompt viewers to consider their mortality. The skull is an example of a memento mori image. And of course, it's symbolic of death. And we have a skull here. But unlike memento mori, vanitas paintings also include other symbols, such as musical instruments, wine, and books, to remind us explicitly of the futility of worldly pleasures and goods. The tipped-over goblet and spilt ink serve a moralizing message on the ephemerality of sensory pleasure. So again, the focus on the inevitability of death, life is transient. Focus your energies on the afterlife. But this humble spread, our work in the Timken picture, suggests different ideas. Whoever consumes this meal doesn't necessarily need to be reminded that the good life only lasts a little while. This particular example of the breakfast pieces genre represents what ordinary life in Harlem might have been like. I'm now privileged to present the museum's Rembrandt, the only painting in San Diego by the most important Dutch artist. And this work from 1657 is called Saint Bartholomew. Rembrandt van Rijn is one of the greatest artists, of course, of all time. And he's acclaimed for his compelling representations of the human condition. He knows how to capture the inner life and feelings of his subjects. He's known primarily for his portraits and landscapes, but he remained interested throughout his life in history and biblical painting. And he turned repeatedly to the Bible as a source of inspiration. Despite the considerable wealth and notoriety that Rembrandt achieved early in his career, by the 1650s, he was facing an extremely difficult time. His beloved first wife, Saskia, had passed away, and his housekeeper had borne a child out of wedlock, bringing great criticism to her and Rembrandt. When she died, Rembrandt remarried Hendrik, who was brought in to help care for his son, Titus. Rembrandt's commissions declined, and he lost money in speculative investments, forcing him into bankruptcy in order to avoid imprisonment. All of his goods and his paintings, his collection of paintings, were sold off, and he had to move to a much poorer district of town. Now, among the works Rembrandt did during this dark period in his life was this portrait of the Apostle Saint Bartholomew, one of the disciples of Christ. Flayed alive for his beliefs, he's holding in his right hand a butcher's knife, the symbol or attribute of his martyrdom. But it's kind of like he's ignoring that knife. And rather, we have here a portrayal of a relatively youthful man with rugged features. And again, this reflects Rembrandt's own vision of biblical figures as unidealized, real people who walk the earth with passions and beliefs, with fears and anxieties similar to those felt by the rest of humanity. Saint Bartholomew leans slightly forward in a low-back chair, and his gaze is averted to the viewer's left. His eyebrow is cocked. Strong light illuminates the right side of his face, revealing his hollow cheek and furrowed brow. His expression is of deep thought, suggesting he might be contemplating his own demise. He's dressed in a plain brown robe over a white shirt, the cuff of which shows radiantly in white at the wrist. A heavier, buff-colored cloak covers the chair. Now notice Rembrandt's celebration of texture through the impasto technique of applying thick layers of paint. We see this around the apostle's face, reinforcing his furrowed brow and contemplative expression, as well as with the burst of white at his cuff, in contrast to the dark brown everywhere else, achieved by using the butt of his brush. Now, coincident with Rembrandt's time is Anthony van Dyck. And here I have the pleasure to show you his portrait of Mary Villiers, Lady Herbert of Shirland. And this dates from 1636. Anthony van Dyck was a Flemish Baroque artist, and he was born 1599 in Antwerp to a wealthy silk merchant. He was very talented and precocious. He started his training at 10, and he became an independent artist when he was 16. He was the most important assistant to the leading Northern painter of the day, Peter Paul Rubens. And while he never surpassed Rubens in terms of popularity, he achieved international fame with his work. He had traveled quite a bit throughout Europe, and in 1632, he was invited to the court of King Charles and Queen Henry Maria of England. And that same year, he was knighted by Charles I and made their principal court painter. This was the first principal court painter in England. Charles commissioned numerous portraits from Van Dyck, not only for members of his own family, but also for foreign friends and ambassadors. Mary Villiers was raised in the royal household, where she enjoyed the status of a princess. Charles I arranged for her marriage when she was 12 to Charles Lord Herbert, who was then 15, the oldest son of Lord Pembroke, and a man of considerable fortune, and one of Van Dyck's earliest patrons. Tragically, Lord Herbert died of smallpox just 2 years later in 1636, which is when this portrait was commissioned by Charles. And on the back of the portrait are his initials, Charles I's initials, and it hung in his collection for quite some time. Though Mary was only 14 years old at the time of this work, she emerges from the dark, plain background in dignified splendor, pointing to one of the black ribbons that suggests her recent widowhood. Heavy pearls gleam at her ears and neck, and she wears the latest fashion, a glowing, low-cut taffeta gown trimmed with silvery lace. Her calm, dispassionate gaze, like her pale skin, signify aristocratic refinement. One question might be, did Lady Villiers borrow Queen Henrietta Maria's pearls. Later known as the Mancini pearls, they still survive today. And here, from the same period, is Van Dyck's portrait of Queen Henrietta Maria of England. And she's wearing a similar dress with the same black ribbon for mourning, and perhaps the same pearls around her neck and earrings. Sadly, Lady Mary Villiers' string of losses didn't end with the death of her father when she was just 6 years old and her first husband. Two subsequent husbands predeceased her, as did both her children. At age 10, her son, and at age 16, her daughter. Now here we have a very well-known self-portrait of Van Dyck. And in the 17th century, demand for portraits was greater than for any other type of work. And everyone wanted to be painted by Van Dyck. He was one of the first fashionable portrait painters. He was able to give an appearance of refined elegance to subjects who lacked those qualities. And he was quite a flamboyant character himself, always wearing a sunflower because it was greatly admired by Charles I. Here's this very well-known self-portrait, which nicely depicts, I think, the artist's personality. Van Dyck spent the remainder of his life in the British court. He received a quiet house of his own, along with a handsome pension of £200 annually from the court. He was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral, an indication of his standing at the time of his death. Van Dyck transformed British portraiture by banishing the stiff, Tudor, and Jacobean images and developing his distinctive, fluid, shimmering, extravagant style that came to dominate portraiture in Britain until the early 20th century. So he was quite an influence on portraiture for a couple of hundred years. Now, this portrait by Frans Hals, which is simply named Portrait of a Man, dates from 1634, about the same time period. And the man, who's age 68, according to the inscription on the painting, which appears in the upper right above the date, with Hal's own initial. We're pretty sure he was married, as his wife had her portrait by Hals painted at the same time. Both these paintings are on identically sized oak panels. Our sitter has a slightly florid complexion, thinning brown hair, a light brown pointed beard, and his hand is raised to his chest, pointing upward to perhaps bring our attention to his face. He's dressed in the black regent robe of a governor, with a black mantle over his left shoulder and a large white ruff collar. Their collars are the same. The subject glances at the viewer in a spontaneous manner, appearing to be a jolly and affable, a lively fellow. His crinkly eyes and a small smile makes us think he's going to break into a broader smile or talk to us. Now notice the spectacular detail of the collar, and I mentioned a similar one is worn by his wife. It's almost transparent, and it seems to reflect light in the sitter's face. This round, flat variation is often called a millstone collar, after its resemblance to that object. It occurs to me, when we say wearing a millstone around their neck, that this is where it comes from. The collar's stiffness forced upright posture, and their impracticality led them to become a symbol of wealth and status. The bigger, the better. And a wonderful sign of Hals's skill is that he painted this intricate collar directly on the canvas. There was no underlying drawing, quite amazing. Frans Hals was born in Antwerp to a weaver who became a painter, And like many, Hals's family emigrated from the Spanish Netherlands to Haarlem when he was quite young, which was when Antwerp was captured by the Spanish forces. In 1610, when he was aged 27, he enrolled as a member of Haarlem's Artists Guild, and he set up his workshop. By the 1620s, he was considered the leading portrait painter in Haarlem. He used strong color and loose slashing, sketch-like brushstroke to give vitality to his portraits. His strokes are clearly visible when you're close up, but from a distance, his paintings form very coherent images that capture the immediacy of the moment. We can marvel at the artist's method, his skills at conjuring personality with a few swiftly applied daubs of paint. Now, later in life, his love of beer and wine that was celebrated in his paintings spilled over into his personal life. With 10 children and a brawling second wife who was often in trouble with the law, he fell out of favor. His creditor took him to court several times, and to settle a bakery debt in 1652, he sold his belongings. Left destitute, the municipality gave him an annuity in 1664, and he too is buried in St. Bavo's Church in Haarlem, like Van Ruysdael. We'll complete today's tour with the smallest painting in the Timken collection, A Lady Receiving a Letter. Done in 1658 by Gabriel Metsu, the painting is part of a Dutch tradition of genre painting, dealing with the popular subject of the love letter. So this is A Lady Receiving a Letter from 1658. Now, writing letters became fashionable in Europe in the 17th century after the establishment of a postal system. In the Dutch Republic, education was strongly emphasized, and the population was quite literate as compared to other European countries earlier on. They developed the first system of mail, but unlike today, the recipient, not the sender of the mail, paid the postage. And the Netherlandish people loved writing letters. We know that the secretary to the Prince of Orange wrote 80,000 letters in his lifetime. This love of letters brings us to this small picture, a scene, a genre scene from everyday life. The young woman in the Timken painting is shown in an elegant garden setting, framed by the arches of an open arcade through which we can glimpse a grand Palladian villa in the distance, conveying elegance and wealth. The delivery of a letter by a messenger, and we know this because of his black hat, appears to have interrupted the young woman who sits with an open book in her lap. As to the identity of the letter writer, art historians are quite certain that the gentleman in another Metsu painting, a man writing a letter now in the collection of the Musée Fabre Montpellier, is the man in question. So the other painting is a man with pen in hand and a maid service, also done within 1 year of our work. There's persuasive evidence that this other work shown here is the pendant painting. Their comparable size and complementary 3/4 length format support the assumption that Metsu conceived them as pendants or companion pieces. A close review of both pictures show that both desks are at the same level and both the individual's hands are in essentially the same position. Each also includes a second person, and they were sold together in 1814, 1815, and 1818. According to a leading scholar of Metsu's work, Metsu represented himself as the man in the Montpellier painting and his wife Isabella as the model for the Timken's work. Metsu was born to the Flemish painter Jacques Metsu, and he spent a good portion of his life in Leiden, where he was a member of the Painting Guild. He left in his 20s after a scandal involving his visit to a brothel, and it was believed that he'd quit painting, but this isn't the case, as several of his works surfaced after he left the guild. So let me leave you today in closing with a bit of postal trivia. A recently rediscovered trunk, 2012, containing 2,600 letters sent from France, Spain, and the Spanish Netherlands between 1689 and 1706 will soon provide a fascinating glimpse into the plight of the early modern European everyman. These letters remained undelivered, including 600 which were never opened because their recipients couldn't be found or they wouldn't pay the outstanding postage costs. The trunk has been stored in The Hague's Museum of Communications since 1926. Now, an international team of experts from various universities is exploring each missive in a groundbreaking project called Signed, Sealed, and Delivered. Our tour has now come to a close, and I know it's been quite a whirlwind run through these masterpieces, but I do hope you enjoyed hearing the stories these works by Rembrandt and his colleagues have to tell. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation. We're, so excited to be able to bring, people these pieces while the museum is still closed. So thank you so much for doing that for us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. So if anyone who's joining us has any questions, I'd be happy to kind of take those now and we can chat with Eleanor. You can either feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask, or you can drop your question into the chat box down below and we'd be happy to address it there. As I said earlier before as well, if you're joining us over Facebook, you can also use the comment section in order to ask any questions. There's the thank you on Facebook. So thank you again, Eleanor. While we're waiting for questions, that was such a fantastic presentation. And I love that little tidbit at the end. That's so exciting. I wonder what all of those letters are going to say.
Yeah, well, I think I don't quite know when the postal system changed in the Netherlands, such that it was the sender who was paying the postage. That was always the case in the United States, but I think it's quite interesting that it was incumbent on the recipient.
That is funny, huh? Yeah, you would think it would, yeah. It makes
I don't want to hear from this person.
Yeah, no, it does make sense as to why there's so many letters that, just didn't go through because people weren't paying them. I mean, it's probably why it changed.
Yes.
The other way. Yeah, but that's so fascinating. I'm sure those people who were sending those letters didn't think they would be opened this many years later, but what an exciting thing to do.
Yeah.
Awesome. Let's see. I don't see any questions quite yet. Any other comments, last questions? I know, as I said, we're happy to, kind of bring these tours to you guys while the museum is still closed. If you are curious about any previous tours that we did, you can also check out our Facebook page, our YouTube page, other social media channels for the Timken, and you will be able to find any previous tours there that are posted if you wanted to take a look back and look. We also do have a lot of upcoming tours as well. We have kind of a regular one being given on Thursdays at this same time. We also have other rotating tours during the week. So please feel free to check out our calendar on the Timken website. And we'd be happy to, have you join us there. We do actually, Eleanor is doing another series during the week on Tuesdays about portraiture. And so if you would like to join us for those, we'd love to have you there.
Interestingly, it's on Anthony Van Dyck, who,
Yes.
of course, we saw Mary Villiers, so you'll have an opportunity to see Mary Villiers again, but the focus is on Van Dyck and all his very luscious, luxuriously dressed nobility and upper class folks.
Yes, that's one of his big, kind of things, that the costumes that are always painted are so gorgeous. So yes, absolutely. Please come join us for that. For the next 2 Tuesdays will be Eleanor's portrait series. So we'd be happy to have you there. But if I don't see any other questions, I think, that is a great place to kind of end. Again, thank you so much for joining us all today. And thanks again to Eleanor. Today was a fantastic presentation. So thank you again. And otherwise, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day.
Thanks, Samantha.
Of course.